Our first speaker, Leila, is a fourth-year PhD student in civil and environmental engineering at UIUC. Her areas of research include land-atmosphere interactions and information theory. She is a Mavis Future Faculty Fellow and is president of the UIUC Colombian Student Association. Today, her talk is about the role of organized land cover heterogeneity on land atmosphere fluxes and intensively managed landscapes. Please welcome Leila, everyone.
Thank you, Yon, for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen? What
Yes.
can you see? The slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Just a second. Oh. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna move this here. Okay, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Yon and Esther for the kind introduction, and also thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. I'm very excited for being here today discussing this topic with Allison after many hours of discussions about flux footprints. And today I'm going to start the conversation by exploring what is the role of the land cover heterogeneity on land atmosphere fluxes at our intensively managed landscape. So for this presentation, I would like you to imagine yourself looking at the Midwestern landscape, but from above. So imagine yourself, you are in a plane or at the top of a tall structure, like the instruments at the tower at 25 meters tall. So now imagine that you are there in July. So it's super hot, it's humid, but all the crops are growing. So from there, you will see that the landscape around you has a land cover pattern that we define as organized heterogeneity, which in few words is a human-induced structure of the arrangement of the crop fields. So in our case, we will see corn and soybean. So now, coming back to the tower, we use a technique called covariance, which uses a gas analyzer and a 3D sonic anemometer to estimate turbulent fluxes of sensible and latent heat flux and also of carbon dioxide flux. So we know that the tower should be measuring somewhere in the system, but where exactly? So our question here is, does the land cover structure impact the resulting measured fluxes at the tower? So the figure at the center schematically is showing the flux tower location. So you have the segmented lines on the mosaic, which represent the tower fetch. That is the distance from the tower when describing the footprint. So this is basically the area that the instruments at the tower can see, and is shown, as you can see in the figure on the left-hand side of your screen, and is shown in 2D. So going back to the figure at the center, the wind direction is gonna be changing over time, and therefore the fetch will shift direction towards the prevalent wind direction. So basically the tower will see different fields at every time step. So another aspects that also affect the size of the flux footprints besides the wind direction are the measurement height, the surface roughness, and the change in atmospheric stability. So to give you a brief idea of how the wind direction shift, I plot the wind rows that you can see on top on the right-hand side. And I used 3 years of data to construct that plot. And as you can see, the prevailing wind direction is coming from the southwest. So in this figure, we have the schematic of the one-dimensional flux footprint that captures the organized heterogeneity of May and the soybean mosaic. So we use land cover data from the USDA with that shows a mosaic of maize and soybeans surrounding the Flux Tower. And we had that for each year of analysis. So we know what, in which location we had corn or soybean every year. So then we draw the density profile over the mosaic, which is the line that you can see in orange. And that density profile represents the relative contribution to the momentum flux as a function of the upwind distance, which is the black dashed line. So the density profile shows that higher contributions comes from locations that are close to the tower, but not immediately underneath, and it decreases as the distance in the x direction from the tower increases. So the Flux Tower measurements are the combined response of the fields that are gonna be intersected by the fetch. So that integration of the fluxes generated by the contributing fields as a function of the distance from the tower is what is gonna provide us the total flux. So to quantify the rate of fluxes, now that we have the momentum flux, that is what is gonna carry the scalars, we need to know what are the actual fluxes that can be emitted by each of the sources. In this case, the sources are the fields of corn and soybean. So to be able to know that from a physical perspective, we use modeling an ecohydrological model that is called MLCAN, that many of you are familiar with. And that was the way how we can obtain those fluxes. So now let's see some of the results from this analysis that I performed for 3 years of analysis. So we have data every 15 minutes, and these plots are like the summary of those 3 years. So here in this figure, we see the seasonal evolution of the average daily fluxes due to the relative contribution of maize in blue color and soybean in green. And we developed this analysis in windows of 6 weeks of data, starting in April 2016 until April 2019. So A is latent heat flux, B is sensible heat flux on top, and below on C you can see carbon dioxide flux, and also D is the relative contribution due to the momentum flux inside the flux footprint. So in this figure, each stack bar refers to the 6 weeks average daily flux for each crop type. And by looking at these plots, we see that the relative contribution of each crop is not half maize and half corn, as many people may think. So for instance, during 2016 and 2017, during the growing season, maize was the crop who contributed the more towards daily latent heat flux, and it's more than the flux released by soybean plots. Whereas during 2018, that situation changed, and now is soybean what is contributing more than maize. And we can continue the analysis for each block, but we are running out of time here, so I'm gonna move to the next slide. And in this slide, I am showing the relative importance of the dominance of a given crop as seen in the field. So here we plot the difference of the percentage of the contributions between the organized heterogeneous mosaic, that is what we have in the field, and the results from a hypothetical homogeneous case. So in the hypothetical homogeneous case, we assume that we have randomly distribution of the two crops and that both reflect equal contributions. So for instance, in terms of latent heat flux, that is on top on the left-hand side, for the total flux from April 2016 until the end of August in 2017, the higher contributions was due to corn. But then for the next year, you can see the green bars. So that means soybean fields contributed the most, and that was similarly what happened for the carbon dioxide flux below. So in terms of sensible, if you see on the right-hand side of your screen now for the sensible heat flux, everything almost is blue. So that means that corn fields always contributed more than soybean fields towards sensible heat flux. And of course, in this, from this analysis, we needed to not only develop this analysis using this ecohydrological perspective, but to compare with the observations that we have at the site from what is captured actually from the instruments. So these plots, it's showing the difference between the Flux Tower observations in red and the modeled in gray for the daily average fluxes of carbon dioxide flux on top and latent heat flux below. So we can also plot the error bars showing the standard deviation of the daily average over the 6-week periods that are the lines in red, and also the lines in black show the same but for the modeling data. So we didn't expect our modeling exercise to match the observations. That was not the purpose of this analysis, but we wanted to provide an effective way to account for the relative contribution due to the two crops. So given our assumptions, such as using a one-dimensional function to describe the flux footprint, that accounts for unusual thermal stability. And we know that in many of the cases, our atmosphere was not neutral. So we expected some of these differences, such as the overestimation that we obtained during the summer months. As you can see, the gray bars are slightly higher than the red squares. So I want to close my presentation by showing this summary slide that was the one that we used for our summer meeting. So we can conclude that the relative contribution of maize and soybean fields to the total flux observed at the Flux Tower is actually a function of its location inside the flux footprint. And the key arguments are, that the human-induced spatial reorganization of the landscape is going to result in an exchange of heat, water, and carbon dioxide that is different from the exchange that will result if the vegetation species were randomly distributed, as usually happen in nature. So here, as we have modified this environment, we also modify the way how the fluxes are going into the atmosphere and are being affected by the system. Another aspect is that the total flux observed at the tower can either increase or decrease as a function of the field's location from the tower. And therefore, the relative contribution of each path should be factored into the interpretation of these fluxes. And why is this novel or significant? We think that we go beyond the statistical models that are used to estimate the relative contribution of flux footprints, because we add an ecohydrological modeling approach to our to our exercise. And what new questions does this lead to? Because a good research exercise should lead to open more questions. So we assume that the vegetation type is here in this exercise is the dominant differentiation factor between the fluxes at different landscape patches, but we know that there are other differentiating factors such as soil moisture or soil nutrients or the random application of different nutrients in the landscape or the topography. So what will be the results of that exchange if we know that we have well-drained maize or drier soybeans? So we can explore that kind of behavior. And also, I think Allison is gonna discuss this further, but we can also use another techniques as the information theoretical approach to open more questions to explore heterogeneity on the landscape. So I'm gonna close my presentation with this, and I'll be very happy to receive questions later. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Leila, for presenting your great work. And as mentioned before, we will keep the questions for later part of the webinar, except for the quick clarifying questions. So then let us move to our second speaker of today. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Allison Goodwell, an assistant professor in civil engineering department at the University of Colorado, Denver. Her research focuses on complex network and information theory approaches to ecohydrologic interactions, models, and water resources systems. And today she will be presenting about causal links between landscape heterogeneity, temporal variability, and tower measured fluxes. So let us welcome Allison.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. Can we see my screen right now? Okay, cool. The view looks different than it usually does for some reason. Okay, so this is going to be very informal because I just did this a few weeks ago, motivated by sending this title to the CINet Junior Council. So there's no better way to get started on a research project than to send someone a title without having done the work beforehand. So I definitely have more questions than answers here, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's definitely a good time to kind of start the discussion about this aspect. But today I'll be following up on Leila's talk and kind of asking a specific question of how do landscape heterogeneity, in the way that Leila defined it as the mosaic of corn and soybeans upon the landscape, and temporal variability, which I'm thinking about kind of as weather, how do these both inform tower measured fluxes separately and together? So I have my summary slide kind of at the beginning here, and then I'll go into a little bit of detail on each of these aspects momentarily. But, you know, from what we know now, we know that, you know, the flux footprint or the upwind contributing area of a given flux measurement provides extra information, or should provide extra information about a flux measurement that is hopefully beyond the knowledge that we can just obtain from other flux drivers that we normally think about. So for example, previous to this experience, if I had looked at a flux tower and thought, you know, what is going to help me predict this flux variable that I've just observed, I would have said, you know, oh, solar radiation or temperature or wind speed. But now we know that the flux footprint itself, or properties of the flux footprint, are actually going to be informative to that flux also. So I don't really know if this is novel and significant yet, but if it is novel and significant, hopefully this can provide a way, or hopefully I can provide a framework for a way to quantify how important or relevant the shifting flux footprint is at a given flux tower site or over a certain time range. So like Leila mentioned, I'm going to be using an information theory-based method. And this provides a nice way to sort of look at this question of, what are these drivers of tower measured fluxes in terms of importance and uncertainty and causality. So you could sort of ask what is causing a given flux measurement at a given time. So new questions that this leads to, or really questions that I started with, are, for example, what features of the flux footprint are relevant to measurements? So for example, is it the landscape heterogeneity in terms of crop type, or is it soil moisture, or is it something else about the flux footprint? Are there different drivers at different time scales? So does the importance of the flux footprint change if we're looking at 15-minute data versus weekly data? And finally, what are the implications for comparing my flux tower data to other types of measurements, whether they're satellite-based or in situ? So I'll talk about this figure a little bit on the next slide. So now we know from what Leila introduced just a few minutes ago that tower measured fluxes are subject to variability in the flux footprint. And the way that I'm kind of very simply illustrating this here is that here we see 2 or 3 different contributing areas at 3 different times. So these could be 3 different days or 3 different measurement points, and each of them is observing a different area of the landscape. So this is what I'm going to refer to as spatial variability. So it's varying in time, but it's a measure of the spatial area that our flux tower is looking at. And the next aspect that I'm going to look at is what I'm going to refer to as temporal variability. And this is the variability at a single location in time. So this could be meteorologic variables like radiation or vapor pressure deficit or temperature, or it could also be our ML-CAN simulated crop fluxes. So I'm going to look at these 2 different aspects as causal drivers or information sources of tower-based fluxes. And, I mentioned this a minute ago, but, why does this matter if you need some convincing? The first thing I thought of is that, we want to make sure that our flux tower data reflects the area that we're actually interested in. So if you have a flux tower and it's seeing this sort of highly variable type of landscape, and you're only interested in a certain area, you kind of want to make sure that your data is actually looking at that area, or your data is representative of that area, I guess. Another reason could be that what if we're interested in using our flux tower data for validation of a remotely sensed flux? For example, if we had a satellite-based evapotranspiration measurement, that satellite-based measurement is only for a single grid cell, and it is not subject to the same sort of variability due to the upwind contributing area. So if we want to compare flux tower data to other types of data that don't have this aspect of the flux footprint, we need ways to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples there, basically. So I'm going to look at these 2 different aspects and try to sort of disentangle the causal mechanisms behind what we're seeing at the flux tower. So a really, really fast course in information theory without any equations, for better or for worse. Information theory is what I'm going to use to establish links between time series variables. So here is an illustration of 2 time series variables. I'm going to consider one to be a source and one to be a target. And when I consider 2 time series variables, I end up with a measure of shared information between my sources and my target that's going to be the reduction in uncertainty of my target given those 2 sources. So I'm reducing so this popped up before I meant it to, but this yellow circle is going to indicate the total uncertainty of my target variable, which in this case is always going to be my tower measured flux. And I'm wanting to look at how much I can reduce that uncertainty given the knowledge, and it went away, given the knowledge of my two source variables, one of which is a spatial variability measure and one of which is a temporal variability measure. And it turns out that this total amount of information, that's this overlapping area of this Venn diagram, so this green and orange overlapping area, can actually be partitioned into different types of information that are redundant, synergistic, or unique. So redundant information is going to indicate an overlap between my two sources, or that both sources provide the same information. Synergistic information is going to be joint information. So this is sort of the extra measure of information in terms of what information do spatial variables provide beyond the knowledge of my weather variability, for example. And finally, uniqueness is going to be information that comes from either a spatial variable or a temporal variable individually. So I have these different types of information that I can look at. What types of information are these two different sources providing to my target? All right, so my plan here is to see how much unique or synergistic or redundant or total information the flux footprint provides along with other variables. So I'm going to use Leila's data set, basically just 15-minute data from the Goose Creek Flux Tower in central Illinois. And I'm just going to look at basically the growing season of 1 year of 2018. And I'm going to look at not just the 15-minute data, but I'm also going to average that data to longer and longer timescales until I'm looking at a 4-day timescale. So I'm going to address that question of differing drivers at different timescales. I'm going to only apply this to daytime data, just due to some fundamental differences in both the way that the model might behave during daytime and nighttime and the way that the flux footprint behaves during daytime and nighttime. So I'm just going to simplify by only looking at daytime values. And I'm going to find the mutual information between pairs of sources and tower measured latent heat flux, and partition that information into synergistic and unique and redundant components. So when you think about spatial variables, really this is sort of a proxy for spatial variability, but I'm going to look at Leila's footprint fraction of soybean. So I'm going to look at the fraction of contribution of the momentum flux towards soybean. So and the reason that I'm only looking at soybean is because it's just 1 minus corn. So if you think of soybean and corn making up 100% of the contribution, I'm just going to look at one of those. And then wind speed is kind of an interesting variable because it's normally what I would think of as a temporal variable, but it is actually what is dictating a lot of this flux footprint in terms of the length of the footprint. So wind speed kind of gets to be in this overlapping category where it is both a temporal weather variable, but it's also part of what dictates the spatial variability. And then my temporal variables are going to be 3 drivers that I've picked out: air temperature, vapor pressure deficit, and solar radiation. And I'm also going to include the MLCAN modeled latent heat flux, because theoretically this modeled latent heat flux should sort of encapsulate these 4 drivers. So I wanted to see how it provides information to the tower-based LE along with spatial variability relative to these drivers individually. So I'm going to pair these up, and I'm going to only look at pairs with the footprint fraction. So I'm going to pair all of these variables up with the footprint fraction and see what joint information they provide to the tower-based latent heat flux. All right, so these aren't, this isn't probably the best way to show this, but what I'm showing here is first of all, just the unique component of the information. So remember, I have basically 4 components that are all going to add up to 1. So the unique from both sources plus the synergistic plus the redundant types of information are going to add up to 100% of the information that these 2 sources provide to our tower measurement. And along the x-axis, I'm looking at my different time scales. So here's the original 15-minute data, and here I've averaged it all the way to get a four-day product, basically. So if you look at kind of this as a whole, on average, we see that about 20% of the total information comes uniquely from the fraction of soy in the flux footprint, and this is pretty similar over all timescales. So what this tells us is that the spatial variability does indeed provide information to the tower measurement that's particular to that spatial variable. So this is information that doesn't come from any of these other variables. And if you look along the y-axis, this is just showing what the footprint fraction is paired up with. So you think about, this is information that the footprint fraction provides uniquely when combined with solar radiation. So like I said, probably not the best way to show this. But we can look at kind of along individual lines and see that, for example, when we consider the footprint fraction and solar radiation at short time scales, that's when our uniqueness from our footprint fraction is quite high. And if we look at wind speed, which is a variable that we would expect to be kind of redundant with the footprint fraction to some extent, because the wind speed is inherently linked to the footprint, we do actually see lower unique information from wind speed. So that was a bit of a sanity check there. And then the second plot is showing, okay, so we have the uniqueness from the footprint fraction. What is the uniqueness from whatever the other variable is? And the other variable is one of these five. And we see that the other variable typically provides more unique information, and especially on longer time intervals. So as we increase our averaging scale, our unique component of information seems to decrease. And particularly, we see that solar radiation at a long time scale provides a lot of unique information when paired with the fraction of soybean. So next we'll move on to synergistic information. And we see basically a pattern where synergistic or joint types of relationships, where these two variables are providing extra information about our tower measurement, it's stronger at longer timescales. However, there is potentially a diurnal cycle issue going on here, which I'm happy to talk about later, but I know that it's there, so that could be one explanation for why we're seeing such a divergence between the sub-daily and the multi-daily data products. However, we see this kind of general trend that as our averaging is longer, our joint knowledge becomes larger. And we see the total opposite for redundant information, where we see a lot of overlapping information. So high redundancy means that our spatial variability and our temporal variability are providing us the same information. And so we see that's pretty prevalent at the lower timescales, but then we see a big shift when we look at the daily and multi-day timescales, where we see very little redundancy. So we're trading synergy and uniqueness for redundancy, depending on whether you're looking at a lower or higher timescale. And like I said, there could potentially be some type of diurnal cycle issue going on here. So finally, in a very preliminary conclusion, knowing something about the flux footprint is informative to the tower measured flux. So this kind of, in some ways, confirms what Leila brings up when she looks at particularly, how much of the latent heat flux in any given time period can be attributed to corn or soybean. This is kind of telling us in a different way that the spatial variability of the footprint is indeed informative. And in general, this informativeness seems to increase on longer timescales. So what this finally is showing is what is the actual total information from both sources for each of these time cases, and we see a pretty steady increase as we go from the 15-minute scale to the 4-day time scale. And like I mentioned previously, at short time scales, we see more redundancy between the spatial and temporal variability, and at longer time scales, we see more joint information or more synergy, which actually tells you that at longer time scales is maybe when the flux footprint matters even more. So this brought up a lot of future questions that I hope to look at in the near or distant future, and they range from really kind of big questions to small questions to, you know, technical changes that I need to make to this type of analysis. But for example, you know, what are the implications of this when we're looking at a remotely sensed ET product? So for example, what if I have a 4-day eco stress ET product and I want to compare it with my 4-day averaged tower-based measurement, and I know that my tower-based measurement is, you know, 30% influenced by the flux footprint. Secondly, how might this vary with flux footprint model? So something I think that Leila brought up is that, you know, there could be a difference in this depending on if we consider our flux footprint as a sort of one-dimensional line versus a two-dimensional area. Also similar to what Leila talked about is that we could wonder how informative are other features of the flux footprint. So the fraction of soybean contribution is just one aspect, and there might be a lot of different things, even if we have a homogeneous vegetation type around our flux tower. We could still have, you know, higher or lower elevation spots. We could have ponding. We could have different soil and moisture, just different types of behavior where the flux footprint could still matter, but for different reasons. And finally, kind of on the technical side, you know, how does this joint causality shift depending on what flux I'm looking at? So for this preliminary analysis, I just focused on latent heat flux or evapotranspiration. But, you know, if this causality shifts with different fluxes, you know, what does that mean? And finally, I want to make sure that I'm comparing apples to apples when I'm looking at different averaging intervals, because there's some stuff going on under the hood here when I change from 15-minute data to 4-day data that I want to make sure are comparable. So that's all I have. Like I said, more questions than answers, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Allison, for a great talk and sharing your new research ideas. So I think now is a great time to ask your questions to the speakers. And when asking the questions, please mention which speaker the question should be directed to, or if you would like the question to be addressed by both of the speakers. And you are welcome to unmute yourself to ask questions or type in the chat.
I have a question for Leila about the footprint around Goose Creek. Is it pretty even between corn and soybean? Or is it shifted more towards one or the other? And how much does that vary by year?
Hi, Ashley. Yeah,
Hi.
thank you for the question. Yeah, it actually changes depending on the decision of the farmers every year. So at the beginning of 2016 and 17, it was more towards corn, but we saw that 2017 and 18, 19, it was more towards soybean. But it is pretty even, especially at the beginning of the years, yeah. But yeah, we were thinking like, okay, if we have like a random, especially distribution of these two crops that we expected to have like sort of similar reaction coming from this even distribution. But then when we look more in detail on how the distance from where each of the crops are, it is important, then we changed our mind and we knew that it is actually very important. Yeah.
Great, thank you. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
We have a chat from Lisa. It's my understanding is soy have a shorter growing season, so if there are very wet springs, farmers might not be able to plant corn and have to plant soy.
Yeah, and that is very true. That it was what happened in one of the years of analysis. I think it was 2018 and 2019, I think. And yeah, and also the leaf density is higher in soy. So we can expect to have different fluxes going from soybean and from corn, depending on the stage of the growing while the crops are growing. So yes, that is something that we also very nicely represent with our modeling exercise using MLChem, and matches what we see at the fields.
So that kind of brings up like there's a time in the spring where you could actually look at, I guess never, I guess like the planting, just the feature of the planting date being different. Like I wonder if you looked at that like very early growing season period, just as, you know, vegetation is starting to emerge differently at different times, that potentially you could have some comparison with almost a bare soil versus a vegetated case that you wouldn't normally see.
Yeah, absolutely. You can immediately see after the crops are starting growing how latent heat flux and carbon dioxide flux start behaving differently. That's what it's actually I can share my screen and show you one of the plots that we got from that analysis. So I hope you're seeing my screen. And so this is the behavior, probably here it's better. So here what you're seeing is the latent heat flux and the sensible heat flux as you in the windows of 6 weeks. And you see after, usually the crops are planted at, between April and May. And as they are growing, then June, July are the more active for the latent heat flux. And then it decreases until harvest, which occurs usually around the end of October or November. And then for the rest of the year, it is not as high as when we have crops on the field. So definitely you can see the influence of the vegetation being a large carrier of fluxes in the field.
I have another question, I guess, for, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Ashley, sorry.
Okay, I guess for both of you, just thinking about, do you think this information that you're learning about this mosaic of the landscape under human managed conditions, would there be any way to use what you're learning and predicting to think about what it would have, what these latent heat fluxes, for example, would have been prior to this rearrangement of land use on the landscape, for example, when it was more forested grassland mix?
I guess the question is for me or for
I
Ellis?
think either. I guess I'm just curious.
Yeah,
about,
go ahead if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, this predictive aspect of what you're learning, it seems really important. Now that you're able to tease apart this data, then instead of just predicting future, would it be possible maybe to think about how our human land use has changed these fluxes from what they used to be?
Yeah, that is a very good idea. And yeah, I have thought about that. And I think one way to do that analysis is by using these kind of ecohydrological models where you can kind of make the configuration of the forest or the ecosystem that was before, and then model that and kind of overlap and compare with this analysis and see what will happen.
Yeah, like I was kind of thinking, you could always make the assumption that if you think your model is really good, you could always model your prairie landscape and say, you know, this is what it would behave like if this was a prairie landscape. But unless you have the actual tower measurements over that landscape, you know, you're not sure. So I guess it would be interesting to have a flux tower in a prairie landscape and that you think is homogeneous, you know, that you think that you have your flux tower in a place where like it's seeing all the same thing, and then be interesting to see whether you still saw that like imprint of like spatial variability. And you wouldn't be able to look at like fractions of vegetation types, but maybe you just literally be looking at like, well, I'm looking northwest versus northeast versus southwest, and like, are there significant differences in that? And then that would kind of tell you like, well, this is how spatially variable the natural landscape could possibly be. But yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I would think you might still have spatial variability in vegetation, like associated with how well drained those different parts of the prairie are, or like Ashley was bringing up that there's forest patches. Sometimes, I mean, I guess that would, the scale of those would depend on where you are, but yeah.
There is another aspect to be considered in there, which is basically the corn is a C4 photosynthesis and soybean is a C3 photosynthesis. Don't know if the prairie grasses are C3 or C4 photosynthesis, but changing the composition, not just in terms of the mosaic, but the dominance of whether C3 or C4 is going to have a significant impact as well. Remembering also that a lot of the prairie landscape were probably very wet as compared to the tile drain landscape we have now. So you're going to also get this predominance of, or I would say more dominance of surface evaporative fluxes because there is so much moisture at the surface and near the surface that the partitioning of energy is going to be different in the historical landscape as compared to now. So I would imagine that there will definitely be more latent heat flux as compared to the sensible because there is more moisture on the surface. But whether there's going to be a differentiated partitioning due to heterogeneity is not that obvious to me. So these are good questions to be explored through modeling.
I had a question for potentially either of you. So now, Leila, that you've built this relationship between the distance from the tower and influence on the footprint, I'm wondering if you can use that relationship to back calculate separate flux time series for individual patches in the mosaic. So for example, I can foresee it being really useful to use a single tower to quantify the flux from these distinct landscape types, whether that's agriculture or other types of landscapes.
Yeah, thank you, Molly, for your question. Yeah, actually, that is a very good question, and many people have been working towards that. And as Allison and I mentioned, now there are in the literature 2D footprints that represent this spatial distribution. So I guess we can move towards that kind of analysis, and just by extending what we did with the 1D footprint to the footprint to be more sure about the areas that we are looking at. And I know there are some people at LICOR, as we saw with Allison last time, that are just looking at very close very, very small systems, and potentially, since we are looking here at a tower that is 25 meters tall, it is more complicated to perform this kind of spatial analysis to know exactly what is the actual flux coming from a specific site. But yeah, potentially that is something that it will be useful to have.
Yeah, like right now I feel like that's magic, but people do stuff like that, you know, like you can, apparently, you know, that there are different ways that you could actually get those kind of like patch level fluxes from your flux tower data.
Would your information theory approaches be useful for that or not?
I don't know.
Let me just add one more thing to that for Molly's question. So we have an Ameriflex site here in Bonneville, not too far from where we are. And they have had a tower at 10-meter height with the goal of analyzing specifically corn or soybean. They wanted it low enough so that it didn't have the mixed influence that we have. So that has been studied for a while. I mean, that has operated for a long time in there. And that was the reason why we decided to do a 25-meter tower so that we could get actually the mix as to what is going on there rather than the individual component.
I think if I can, I had like kind of a follow-on question to that. And that, just like you said, those smaller towers tend to observe, say, corn in one year or soybean in another year. So they're experiencing different environmental conditions. So you don't have that simultaneous, you know, the same environmental conditions in two different vegetation types. So if you can kind of do kind of what Molly was suggesting, right? If you have a time series for a soybean patch and a time series for the corn patches, right? Then you can compare, I'm interested in water use efficiency, right? The water use efficiency of each of those two different crop types under the same environmental conditions. I don't know if that's, I mean, maybe I don't know if it adds any more to the story than studying only corn or only soy, but it feels like.
Yeah, like it would enable you to get two data sets that are really concurrent.
Yeah, feels like
rather than actually having two flux towers in the same, or, you know, like in a, like, I guess the other way to do that would be to have two flux towers in adjacent fields that are short enough to only be observing those particular fields.
Right.
But yeah, like potentially for a very tall tower, you're seeing a very large range of variability in both vegetation types and soil moisture and like field management, you know, so it'd be like, if you could do that sort of like disentanglement, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely harder. Like, is it worth all that extra work? Yeah.
Yeah, but actually considering that a flux tower experiment is very expensive and it's hard to maintain, then exploring the most of your experiments, it will be absolutely the best way to continue doing this kind of research. So I think it's a very good point what you are bringing up here.
Have you thought about doing ground measurements in the downwind direction? So measuring things that you're measuring in the flux tower, measuring it at the ground level.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to like move every day with the wind direction? I mean, like there's like the dominant wind direction. Yeah, so, you know, yeah, so you could like choose the dominant wind direction and plop a measurement.
The other thing I was going to mention is that there's a tower set up about 2 miles southwest. We saw that when we were out on the field trip, and I asked the farmer, and they're using that to collect data to determine if they were going to put a wind farm at that site. So I think it's comparable size or height to the flux tower.
We saw that one, and somebody, is that the Bonneville? That's not the Bonneville site.
No, that's just the one that was at the next site we went to.
Yeah, Tim pointed that out to me, and I was like, I don't think that's Bonneville, but yeah. I don't know what it is.
I just was talking to the farmer this week, and he mentioned, I asked him what that was, and he said, oh, they're measuring some things for determine if they're going to put a wind farm in that area. So if you think that's useful, I could ask some more questions and see who's running that.
Yeah, also, yeah, I'm trying to remember where this was, but if they put a wind farm, then does that affect all the stuff that we are doing? Because it's going to be upwind of where we are. It's going to probably be within the flux footprint, at least above a certain velocity, right? Wind speed. And so we have to think about that.
I was thinking if you wanted to QA/QC your wind measurements.
And I think our wind measurements are fine.
Well, actually, I was thinking the other day that maybe they're not, because if you think about the length of the fetch, it's pretty long, you know, like we're looking at like a few kilometers of length. And for example, if our wind direction was just a few degrees off, that could like pretty significantly influence the fractions of these vegetation types that you're seeing, right? So I was just looking at, you know, like we have a few redundant measurements in our, like, you know, giant flux tower file, and they're not, they don't all agree exactly, you know, so it's like the error is, you know, several degrees, like, you know, it's just kind of like, it struck me that that could potentially be significant.
Yeah.
So,
As
Leila.
that I think that it can be a source of uncertainty, definitely, but I think overall it will be like, I kind of trust the wind direction instrument at the top, and yeah, I don't know to what extent really will influence a significant difference, because we are doing this as the average of the 15 minutes. So maybe if we then analyze data, oh yeah, if for instance you are analyzing the data of the over 30 minutes, then your average wind direction is absolutely gonna change, and then your flux footprint is gonna change too. So the fraction definitely is gonna change. So it's for your analysis, you are doing using the same fraction for different times, average, then you will have to also redefine the fraction for each of the windows, because the wind direction changes over that window. So you are going to have a different average of the wind direction. Good point.
So Lisa, regarding a question for the water use efficiency, I posted a paper in the chat box. This is the first paper on the development of multi-layer canopy model. It's very, very long, but it has a lot of these characterizations.
Yeah, I was just reading the abstract.
So figure 16, if you go down to all the way.
Working in these sites, those soybean canopies are so dense.
Oh yeah, I have walked in those canopies in August or at 6 a.m. in the morning, and you walk maybe 20, 25 meters and come back, you are totally drenched. Your jeans are wet. They hold so much dew in there.
Right, but the interesting thing is it's only in the upper part of the canopy. The lower part of the canopy, it's still nice and warm, and it's dry.
Yeah, but there's so much foliage in the upper part of the canopy.
But like the microenvironments are just very different. Yeah.
And I have a time-lapse picture of how these leaves basically open up to the sun, and then they follow the sun. It's just amazing in there. It's absolutely beautiful. So, okay, looks like we had a great discussion here.
I would hate to interrupt and end this discussion, but it's now we're over 11, so the webinar will officially end right now. And if you have more questions to the speakers, you can reach out to them via email. And otherwise, thank you all for joining in today and staying in the webinar, although it went a little longer than expected. So, and also special thanks to our both of our speakers today, Leila and Allison, and hope you enjoyed the session today.